Chapter 6 is our first organ system that we'll study. So the integumentary system is also known as our skin. So we'll actually go through all the different components of skin and the accessory organs that are inside the skin and how the skin helps us to regulate other functions inside our body. The integumentary system consists of the skin and the accessory organs of the hair, nails, and cutaneous glands. The skin is the body's largest and heaviest organ just because it covers all over the surfaces of our body, and so therefore it has a lot of mass to it. So there's 3 layers to our integumentary system. You have on the most outside layer the epidermis, which is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. The dermis tissue, which is below that, so below the basement membrane between underneath the epidermis. It's a connective tissue layer, and then below the dermis is your hypodermis. So it's another connective tissue layer. It's not a part of the skin, but it is associated with it. So here is a picturized version of those 3 layers. So my on-campus class, you will have to do some labeling off this figure. So up top, we have the epidermis here, so right above this little wavy line, that's where that basement membrane is for the epidermis. So out here, in the most external surfaces. Then down here in the dermis region, you have the connective tissue underneath. Then of course some of all of your accessory organs start here. So not pictured, of course, is the nails, but still starting from that layer. And then below that is the hypodermis. So your hypodermis layer has a lot of subcutaneous fat as well as a lot larger blood vessels. So it's also a target site when you receive injections. So when you're getting an injection, they're actually targeting these larger blood vessels in that layer. So if you ever heard of a hypodermic needle, it's because that needle is specialized to go specifically at this depth to reach those large blood vessels in the hypodermis. In the integumentary system, there's 2 types of skin based on thickness. So you have your thick skin that covers the fronts of your hands as well as the bottoms of your feet. So basically palm region and the bottom of your feet. This type of skin has sweat glands but no hair follicles, or sebaceous, or also called oil glands. And of course, it's thick skin, so it's thicker than the rest of your skin. The thin skin covers the rest of the body. So that part has hair follicles, also has oil glands and sweat glands, and it's a whole lot thinner. So here we go from 0.5 millimeters thick to 0.1 millimeters thick. So there's different functions of the skin. Our skin is very resistant to trauma as well as infection, so protecting the outside of the body. And it does this through keratin, which is a protein that helps to strengthen the upper layers of skin, dermacidin and defensins, and lastly the acid mantle. So on the surface of your skin, the sweat and oil that's on the surface creates a slightly acidic surface for your skin, and that helps to prevent bacterial growth. Other functions of the skin, so retain water, protect against UV radiation, protect against harmful chemicals coming deeper inside the body. It also helps to create our vitamin D, so it actually carries out the first step in creating vitamin D using UV light from the sun. And then the livers and kidneys will complete the process to make our final product of vitamin D. Other jobs of the skin is for sensation, so receiving all your touch, so temperature, whether or not something's hot or cold, actual physical touch, so pressure on your skin, your pain, so your level of pressure enough to your nerves to think that there's some kind of damage possible, and then other receptors for sensation. So we've already talked about this, our thermoregulation for our skin. So again, being able to receive sensation for temperature. And then, of course, vasoconstriction and vasodilation, so making the blood vessels smaller to retain heat or larger to get rid of heat. And lastly, perspiration, so our sweat glands, putting that layer of water on the surface of our skin so our sweat can remove heat from the body. And lastly, it's also involved with nonverbal communication, so the muscles underneath the skin moving, for example, the skin on top to allow us to show different emotions. Focusing on now our most external layer, which is our epidermis. So the epidermis is a type of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. So we have all of our cells, are at least the basement one, basal ones located on the basement membrane, so that's the epithelial tissue. It's stratified, so there's multiple layers of them. The cells that are layered in multiple layers are the squamous, so our flat egg-shaped ones. And it's also keratinized, so that keratin protein helps to strengthen the upper layers of this tissue. For the epidermis, there's also dead cells at the skin surface, so that keratin protein helps to prevent them from those top layers from just easily flaking off. The epidermis lacks blood vessels, so has to get its nutrients from the underlying connective tissue, so diffusing from the dermal tissue layer or dermis tissue layer. Those nutrients just have to diffuse through. So, so when you're making, for example, new cells, your nutrients are only going to be at the bottom layers of the epidermis, and so you can make new cells there. And then those cells are also going to migrate a little bit. You still have some nutrients, so they're still able to live, but eventually they're going to get too far away and die off. Nice little happy ending there. They also contain nerve endings for touch and pain, so with our sensation. There are 5 epidermal cell types. So the first type are the stem cells. So these are undifferentiated cells that will eventually become our keratinocytes, which are our basic skin cells. Those stem cells are found in the deepest layer of the epidermis, called the stratum basal, so the layer that actually touches your basement membrane. Next type of cell are your keratinocytes. So these are just your generic skin cells that will eventually become keratinized, and they make keratin. Eventually, that keratin gets bundles and strengthens the upper layers of the epidermis. Third type of cell are our melanocytes. So their job is to make the melanin pigment. So the melanin pigment is what gives our skin its color. It also helps to protect the DNA in the cells from UV radiation, so from the sun's ultraviolet rays. They're only in the stratum basal layer, but they are spread among the keratinocytes, so these little branched parts of that cell will branch up into the different multiple layers, and that way help to distribute the melanin into the keratinocytes, and then those keratinocytes will continue to migrate to the surface. Last 2 epidermal skin cells are the tactile cells, so these are for touch sensation. In the basal layer of the epidermis, so right near the bottom where the basement membrane is located. And lastly, dendritic cells. So with your skin being on the outside of your body, it's very susceptible to pathogens from external sources. So there's a macrophage that helps to guard against pathogens, so located in the epidermis. So as you, for example, if you might have a pathogen that maybe through a cut or something gets into the epidermis, then these immune system cells can then phagocytize them, so basically eat the pathogen and destroy it. So these dendritic cells are found in the stratum spinosum and stratum granulosa layer, so higher up in the layers than the stratum basal. There are 5 layers to the epidermis, depending on if you're in thick skin or thin skin. So if you're in thick skin, then you're going to have all 5 layers. If you're in thin skin, you're going to be missing a layer. So for your thick skin, you start off here where there's the basement membrane. Both types of skin have the stratum basal layer, then moving up the stratum spinosum layer, then the stratum granosum layer, and then only in thick skin do you have the stratum lucidum layer, and then lastly the stratum corneum, so the layer of dead skin cells on the outside surface. So if we're looking at this model of skin, which is also found in the lab, we have up here at the top where we have our gray, that's part of our epidermis. Below that, this is the dermal tissue layer, and below that is your hypodermis, so all these little fat cells here. So differences between the epidermis for thick versus thin skin. So here we have the extra layer, the stratum lucidum layer, the little yellow line for your thick skin. And then with thick skin, it also have way more layers of dead skin cells on the stratum corneum layer than your normal thin skin. The epidermis lies on the most exterior surface of the skin. So we have epidermis, which are 4 to 5 layers, depending whether or not it's thin skin or thick skin. This, again, is epithelial tissue, and it rests on the basement membrane. So again, being epithelial tissue, it's going to have a basement membrane. Below that basement membrane is the dermis tissue, so it's a type of connective tissue. Again, deeper than the basement membrane, so below it, so our little blue line here. Deeper than basement membrane provides the nutrients for the epidermis, so the blood vessels that run here, those nutrients located in the dermis coming out of the blood vessels that are in that layer, and then they'll diffuse into the first few layers of the epidermis. Lastly, underneath the dermis is the hypodermis layer, so our subcutaneous tissue. A lot of fat in this area, a lot of blood vessels. So again, those blood vessels are what's targeted for our hypodermic injections. Okay, so for my on-campus class, you will have to be able to label your different strata for your epidermis skin. So, but I'm still going to tell everybody else too. So here at the bottom is our dermal tissue with all our blood vessels. Then before we get into the epidermis, remembering here is your basement membrane. So that's where it aligns on, where the epidermis aligns onto. So basement membrane here, then slightly above it, our first layer, our stratum basal layer. So that's where our stem cells are located. So that's what this represents. Also have these tactile cells, which are for touch sensation, so they'll send that message to this nerve ending here. We have this melanocyte, so these cells are going to make the melanin skin pigment, and then the keratinocytes will pick up that pigment and continue to migrate towards the surface. Next one is a dendritic cell. So this is that immune system cell that migrates through, will actually stay stationary in the skin, so it can't move, unlike if it were like in the connective tissue down here. So stays stationary here, but if you do have a pathogen that's able to get into the skin, then these are located there to phagocytize or eat up that pathogen. And our last and most abundant skin type is the keratinocytes, so all throughout all your multiple layers. Once they get towards the top of the layers, they get thinner and smaller. Eventually they'll die off and become part of the stratum corneum layer. So stratum basal layer, this first bottom layer here. Then above it, the stratum spinosum layer. Then we'll get to later why this one's special by itself. The stratum granosum layer, so there's these dark staining granules in this layer, so the granule part. Then again, only in your thick skin, you have your stratum lucidum layer. And above that is the stratum corneum layer. So that's just your last layer, ton of dead skin cells that Eventually will flake off, as you see on the top, but those again help to protect our skin from being abraded or rubbed off. I'm going to quickly go through the different layers of the epidermis. So our stratum basal layer, the one that's on the basement membrane, so single layer because it's the only one that's going to touch the basement membrane. That's where your stem cells are, as well as some of your keratinocytes. So in this layer and in the stratum spinosum layer, which is just above it, are the two layers where you're going to get new keratinocytes. And then these last three layers, again, stratum lucidum, only found in thick skin. Stratum granulosa layer, it's only a few layers of keratinocytes. Again, having these keratohyalin granules, they will stain darkly in a tissue slide preparation. And those granules, when they release the keratohyalin, it helps to bundle up the keratin protein and makes those bundles tougher. Again, lucidum, only in thick skin, and it has, the skin cells there have a clear protein called elidin. So that helps to block out the melanin in the more deeper layers. So for example, maybe see the difference between them. So I have my skin, which has a lot of melanin, spent a lot of time in the sun this summer. Then if I flip my hand to the palm side where there's the thick skin, then there you don't see that darker color. It's actually lighter, so darker, lighter. It's because of that stratum lucidum layer. The clear protein is blocking your ability to see through that layer and see the melanin. The last layer is the stratum corneum, so multiple layers, dead, scaly, keratinized skin. So this layer helps to resist abrasion, so helps to prevent your skin from getting cut, helps to prevent your skin getting penetrated or poked, also helps to prevent water loss from the body. Now we'll move on to the life history of a keratinocyte. So your keratinocytes are born in the stratum basal layer from the stem cells differentiating or through mitosis of other keratinocytes. So in the basal layer or in the stratum spinosum layer. So once your keratinocytes are born, so new ones are going to push the older ones up into more superficial layers of the skin. Over time, the keratinocytes will flatten. They also produce more keratin, so it makes those layers even tougher. Oops. Also containing these membrane-coating vesicles. Eventually, after about 30 to 40 days, the new keratinocyte will eventually reach the top layer of skin and will most likely exfoliate, or particularly in your thick skin, continue to pack on multiple layers on that stratum corneum. If, let's say, you have a patch of skin that you rub up against a lot, so for example, if you work with tools a lot and you're having to grip, for example, like a hammer, or if you're wearing shoes that are too tight and so your feet are rubbing against certain parts of your shoes, then that stratum corneum layer will actually become even thicker, so even more layers of those dead keratinocytes being packed on top of each other. So in the stratum granulosa layer, so that dark staining layer, the keratohyalin granules that are the ones that stain darkly will release the filigin protein. That protein binds up the keratin so that it even makes them even more tougher. These cells will also release a lipid mixture that will spread out across that layer, and that helps to waterproof that layer. So if we're looking at, go back to our little model here. Actually, we'll go back to the model in a second. So this layer helps to waterproof your skin, so creating the epidermal water barrier. And the water is kept inside your body through tight junctions between the cells, so it prevents the water from being able to leak out. So that prevents dehydration, but it doesn't prevent the absorption of water. So when her hands are in water too long and they start getting all wrinkly, becoming prune fingers, that's due to the water being absorbed into those upper layers of skin. Now we'll go to our model. Here in our model, so we have our thin skin and our thick skin. So that stratum granosum layer, where it's little dark specks here, that is the waterproof layer. So everything above that, so the stratum lucidum layer and thick skin, and the stratum corneum for your thin skin and thick skin, so here and here, those layers will absorb water. So as you're absorbing water, what happens is that part expands, but the layers below it doesn't. So in order to accommodate that excess water, that part of the skin will start to fold because your bottom layers aren't stretching out because they're not getting that water excess. So that causes the skin to fold up since it has more volume and therefore more surface area needing accommodating the same space. Dropping below the epidermis, we have our dermis connective tissue. So underneath the basement membrane. The dermis tissue is mostly made of collagen, so those fibroblasts that are in this connective tissue will make collagen fibers to help create the structure for our dermal tissue. There's a lot of blood vessels. This is also where our sweat, oil, and nerve endings are located. Also has our hair follicles as well as the roots of our nails. The dermis has a wavy, conspicuous boundary with the superficial epidermis. So this also also causes a difference in the shape for our two layers of our dermal tissue. So up near the wavy boundary, you have these called the dermal papillae, and they'll extend upward from the dermis, and so it helps to interlock with the epidermis, and so that helps to keep those layers stuck together and keeps them from sliding off. The ridges from the epidermis are the epidermal ridges that dip down and link with the upward dermal papillae from the dermis. So when there's a large prominent wave between the dermis and epidermis, it actually produces your fingerprints. So I'm going to go back to our little model here. So here we have our wavy basement membrane, these ridge between the dermal tissue and the epidermis above it, and showing our little papillae here. So it kind of look like fingers sticking up, so it helps to interlock the epidermis and dermal tissue, so keep them from sliding off each other. Like the epidermis above it, the dermal tissue has has layers, except for it only has 2 layers. So the part of the dermal tissue that has the finger-like extensions into the epidermis, that layer is the papillary layer, so our most superficial zone. It allows for a lot of our leukocytes, so our white blood cells and other defense cells, to migrate through this layer. So again, protecting our body from the outside environment. The connective tissue in this area is a lot looser than the deeper layer of the dermis, so again allowing for that mobility in that region. And there's also a little bunch of small blood vessels in the papillary layer, so right up at the top, only where the little fingers are. Below that is the reticular layer. It's deeper than the papillary layer. It's also thicker, and it's made of dense, irregular connective tissue, so more stronger, supportive layer. If this layer gets damaged, Then once it repairs, this is where you get your stretch marks from. So here's a picture of it. So here we have our little finger extensions up into towards the epidermis. So only this portion here is your papillary layer. So only that portion, only about that deep. And then below it is that reticular layer. So I know on the on-campus exam, you have to be able to label, not from this picture, from the earlier cartoon picture, the two layers of the dermis tissue. So your papillary layer and your dermal layer. Dropping down again, below the dermis tissue, we have our hypodermis layer. So the hypodermis layer is the subcutaneous tissue, has more areolar connective tissue and adipose or fat than the dermal tissue. It helps to pad the body and stick the skin to the underlying tissue, so it keeps the skin from falling off. Again, help padding the body, so it helps with cushioning. So, if you do fall, at least you have a little bit of cushion there to help you. A lot of larger blood vessels, they're there. Lot of blood vessels are just located there too. So it's also a very common site for drug injection. Right there, kind of close to the skin, but still able to enter into those blood vessels. So they're large enough to get that needle into it. Your hypodermis contains your subcutaneous fat, which can be used as an energy reservoir using the triglycerides that are stored there. It's also used for thermal insulation, so help to protect the body from the outside colder environment, since the fat is less able to is affected less by outside temperatures. It's thicker in women, so again, making the curves of a woman, as well as being thinner in infants. So this is why they're always wrapped up in a blanket. And same thing with elderly. So this is why grandma is wearing a, sweater and a turtleneck shirt in the middle of July, because she has thin skin, doesn't have much fat, or at least subcutaneous fat, and so she needs a little extra help. One more time before moving on, our little cartoon version of our integumentary system, at least our different layers. So most external layer, all the way up here, is the epidermis, so showing how kind of like they're peeling it off. In between the epidermis and your dermal tissue is your basement membrane. Right there, right below the basement membrane, is your dermal papillae, so your papillary layer of the dermal tissue. Below that, your reticular layer of your dermal tissue. And then below that, you have your hypodermis with your blood vessels that are targeted for injections, as well as your subcutaneous fat. And also just mentioned on here, your accessory organs are located in your dermal tissue. Majority of our skin coloring comes from the melanin pigment that is produced by the melanocytes, so that particular cell in the stratum basal layer, which then gets taken up by the keratinocytes and spread out among the rest of your skin layers. So there's two forms of melanin. You have eumelanin, which is more of a brownish black color, and pheomelanin, which is more reddish yellow in color. So although you can have people who have varying degrees of melanin in their skin, they actually have the same number of melanocytes. So it's not like someone who has darker skin has more of those cells and therefore produces more melanin. It's just because they produce more melanin with the same number of cells. For darker skinned people, it breaks down more slowly. So they get a tan, it's going to stick around for quite a few months. The granules are more spread out. So across that cell, the granules are more spread out, and so therefore showing more color. Again, gives it also more space to put the increased greater quantities of melanin in that cell. So spread out that greater amount in that squamous cell. And then lastly, these cells are seen throughout the epidermis, so throughout multiple layers. So color packed on top of color and helps to have the look of darker skin. For lighter skinned people, their melanin is clumped just near the nucleus, so melanin's job again is to protect against UV damage, protect the DNA from UV damage. So in lighter skinned people, it's just around the nucleus, so only around where that is, versus in a darker skinned person, more spread out. And for lighter skinned people, there's little melanin seen beyond the stratum basal layer. So instead of having color on top of color, just at that bottom layer, and then you have multiple layers of just regular skin cells that don't have that melanin, and so you end up tends to make the skin more pale looking. So kind of, I'm going back to our thick skin versus thin skin, where there's same amount of melanin is in both layers of skin, but because you have that elidin protein blocking the ability to see the melanin, you can't see the melanin through that layer of the stratum lucidum layer. So color here, no color there. Other examples of coloring on the skin are due to freckles and moles. So it's a aggregation of melanocytes in a particular area. So sun exposure causing those melanocytes to aggregate because you're trying to protect your DNA because you've had all this sun exposure. So end up getting either freckles or sometimes moles. And these are the ones that have to be watched out for. So monitoring them, seeing if they change color, diameter, or contour. So if they change their shape, because maybe they are suggesting that you might have cancer. So some people, particularly if that runs in their family, they have to make sure they pay attention to that. Last one is hemangiomas or birthmarks. So sometimes it's just benign tumors of the dermal capillary. So it's benign, so it's harmless. Some disappear in childhood. Some of them just stay with you. So one I was going to point out is the port wine stain, very famous birthmark on the former president of Russia, Mikhail Gorbachev, on his forehead. That's actually a port wine stain birthmark. So, about to start part 2.